They said it would never happen. They said American boys fresh from farms and factories could never defeat the warriors who had ruled the Pacific skies for years. Japanese pilots stood in their briefing rooms and laughed when they heard about the American training programs, dismissing them as childish games played by soft men who knew nothing of real combat. These were the same Japanese aviators who had devastated Pearl Harbor, who had swept through Southeast Asia like an unstoppable storm, who had turned the ocean itself into their personal battlefield. They had trained since childhood in the way of the warrior, their discipline forged in ancient tradition and sharpened by years of actual warfare in China. When they looked at intelligence reports about American pilot training, they saw weakness, inefficiency, and a nation completely unprepared for the brutal reality of aerial combat. The American pilots were so green that some had barely 100 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. The Japanese veterans had thousands. It seemed like a mathematical certainty, a foregone conclusion written in blood and fire across the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. But what happened next would shock the world and rewrite everything military strategists thought they knew about warfare, training, and the power of innovation against tradition. This is the story of how underestimated American pilots turned mockery into legend, how desperation bred innovation, and how the hunted became the hunters in the deadliest sky war the world had ever seen. In the early months of 1942, Japanese pilots owned the Pacific sky with an arrogance born from undeniable success. Their Mitsubishi Zero fighters danced through the air with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, outmaneuvering every Allied aircraft they encountered. These were not ordinary pilots, but carefully selected warriors who had undergone training that would break most men before they ever sat in a cockpit. The Japanese Naval Air Service demanded perfection from its candidates, putting them through physical and mental challenges that eliminated all but the most determined. Young boys entered training academies where they learned not just to fly, but to embody the spirit of Bushido, the ancient warrior code that valued honor above life itself. They practiced aerobatics until the movements became as natural as breathing, flew in all weather conditions until they could navigate by instinct alone, and studied tactics with the intensity of chess masters preparing for world championships. By the time they reached operational squadrons, these pilots had accumulated flight hours that American instructors could only dream of providing to their students. The Zero itself seemed designed to reinforce Japanese superiority, with a climb rate and maneuverability that left American pilots stunned during their first encounters. It could turn inside any American fighter, climb faster than anything in the Allied arsenal, and had a range that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Japanese commanders watched their pilots dominate the skies over the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, and they became convinced that their training philosophy and warrior spirit created an invincible force. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo described American military aviation as chaotic, poorly organized, and staffed by men who lacked the spiritual dedication necessary for aerial combat. Japanese officers read these reports during evening sake sessions and agreed that the Americans would never develop pilots capable of challenging their supremacy, because American culture valued individual comfort over collective sacrifice and encouraged softness rather than the hardness required of true warriors. The situation facing America in early 1942 was nothing short of catastrophic. The Pacific Fleet lay shattered at Pearl Harbor, American forces were surrendering across the Pacific, and the Army Air Corps and Navy aviation programs faced a crisis that threatened the entire war effort. The United States had fewer than 3,000 trained military pilots when war began, and many of those were instructors too valuable to risk in combat. The Japanese had tens of thousands of trained aviators, and were producing more every month from training programs that had been running at full capacity since the mid-1930s. American aircraft factories were just beginning to gear up for wartime production, while Japanese industry was already operating at peak efficiency. The few American pilots who had faced the Japanese in combat returned with terrifying stories of enemy superiority, describing dogfights where their aircraft seemed to move in slow motion compared to the Zeros that hunted them. Some pilots refused to fly again after their first encounter with Japanese fighters, their nerves completely shattered by the experience. Military planners in Washington faced a simple mathematical problem that had no obvious solution. They needed tens of thousands of pilots immediately, but traditional training programs took years to produce combat-ready aviators. The Navy's peacetime approach involved careful selection, extensive ground school, hundreds of hours of flight training, and gradual progression through increasingly complex aircraft. This system produced excellent pilots but far too slowly for wartime needs. The Army Air Corps faced similar challenges with training programs designed for a small peacetime force, suddenly expected to produce pilots for a global war. Early attempts to accelerate training by simply shortening courses proved disastrous, with accident rates skyrocketing and pilots arriving at combat squadrons dangerously unprepared. The Japanese continued their advance, and American commanders knew that without a radical solution, the entire Pacific might fall before enough pilots could be trained to mount an effective defense. Into this desperate situation stepped a group of unconventional thinkers who would revolutionize pilot training forever. Commander John Thatch of the United States Navy was one of these innovators, a pilot who understood that America could never match Japanese training time, but could match Japanese tactics through systematic analysis and innovative techniques. Thatch began studying combat reports with the intensity of a detective solving a murder case, looking for patterns and weaknesses in Japanese fighting methods. He noticed that while individual Japanese pilots were indeed superior in aircraft handling, they tended to fight as individuals rather than as coordinated teams. American pilots, when working together using predetermined tactics, could compensate for their lack of experience through mutual support. Thatch developed what would become known as the Thatch weave, a defensive maneuver where two American fighters flew in a crisscross pattern that allowed them to protect each other while setting up ambush opportunities against pursuing Japanese aircraft. This single tactical innovation transformed the dynamic of aerial combat, because it gave green American pilots a fighting chance against veterans who could outfly them individually. Meanwhile, in the Army Air Corps, officers like Claire Chennault were reaching similar conclusions about the importance of tactics over individual skill. Chennault had spent years in China studying Japanese aviation and had developed a deep understanding of both their strengths and their weaknesses. He insisted that American pilots should never try to dogfight with Zeros, but should instead use the superior diving speed and ruggedness of American aircraft to make slashing attacks, and then escape before the enemy could respond. These tactics required discipline rather than skill, making them perfect for inexperienced pilots who could follow a simple rule set even under the stress of combat. The innovation extended beyond tactics to the structure of training itself. Aviation psychologists began studying what skills were actually essential for combat success versus which skills were traditional holdovers from peacetime flying. They discovered that many components of existing training programs contributed little to combat effectiveness while taking valuable time. This research led to radical restructuring of courses, eliminating non-essential material and focusing intensely on the specific skills needed to survive and win in aerial combat. American training programs transformed with breathtaking speed once military leadership committed to radical change. New pilot training facilities sprouted across the American heartland like mushrooms after rain, with flat fields in Texas, Arizona, and California suddenly hosting thousands of young men learning to fly. The Navy established training stations in Florida, Georgia, and along the Gulf Coast, where perfect weather allowed year-round flight operations. These were not the small, carefully managed programs of peacetime, but massive industrial operations designed to process thousands of students simultaneously. The Army Air Corps created a pipeline system where students progressed through multiple bases, each specializing in a specific phase of training. Primary training taught basic flying skills in simple aircraft like the Stearman PT-17, a forgiving biplane that could survive the abuse of inexperienced pilots. Basic training moved students to more complex aircraft and introduced formation flying, navigation, and instrument work. Advanced training specialized students into fighter, bomber, or transport tracks and introduced them to the high-performance aircraft they would fly in combat. The Navy adopted a similar progressive system, but placed greater emphasis on carrier operations, adding training phases specifically focused on the unique challenges of landing on moving ships. What made this revolution truly radical was the acceptance that accident rates would be high, and that some percentage of students and aircraft would be lost during training. This cold calculation horrified traditional military officers, but was absolutely necessary to produce pilots in the numbers required. Safety standards that would have been unacceptable in peacetime became tolerable when compared to the alternative of losing the war. Training time per pilot dropped dramatically, with some fighter pilots reaching operational squadrons with less than 200 total flight hours, a number that would have been considered criminally negligent before the war. The curriculum focused obsessively on combat-relevant skills, particularly gunnery, formation flying, and the specific tactics that men like Thatch and Chennault had developed. Students spent hours in ground school studying Japanese aircraft and tactics, learning to recognize the silhouette of a Zero instantly, and understanding the precise maneuvers to use when attacked. Gunnery training became particularly intensive, with students firing thousands of rounds at towed targets until deflection shooting became instinctive. The Navy developed synthetic training devices that simulated combat conditions, allowing pilots to practice tactics without burning precious fuel or risking aircraft. These innovations compressed experience that might have taken years to acquire naturally into a few months of focused instruction. Japanese military culture viewed the American training revolution with contempt that bordered on disbelief. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo described the shortened American programs, the low flight hours of graduating pilots, and the reliance on technological aids rather than pure skill development. Senior Japanese officers shared these reports with subordinates as examples of American weakness and lack of warrior spirit. How could a nation that rushed its pilots through training in mere months expect to compete with aviators who had dedicated their entire lives to perfecting their craft? The Japanese system emphasized individual mastery, with pilots expected to achieve near-perfect aircraft control through endless practice. Formation flying was considered less important than individual dogfighting ability, because Japanese doctrine emphasized the decisive nature of individual combat. When Japanese pilots heard that Americans were teaching defensive tactics like the Thatch weave, they laughed at what they perceived as admission of inferiority. Real warriors attacked, they said, and only cowards flew defensive patterns. This mockery was not mere bravado but reflected genuine cultural differences in how the two nations approached warfare. Japanese training emphasized spirit and willpower, teaching that dedication and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. American training increasingly emphasized systematic analysis and technological solutions, seeking ways to multiply the effectiveness of individual pilots through better tactics and equipment. Japanese pilots flew aircraft stripped of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to maximize performance, accepting vulnerability as the price of superiority. American designers added armor, stronger structures, and redundant systems, accepting reduced performance to increase survivability. These were fundamentally incompatible philosophies, and neither side initially understood how the other could possibly succeed. Japanese veterans returning from combat in mid-1942 began reporting something unexpected, however. The American pilots they faced were still generally inferior in aircraft handling, but they were becoming more difficult to kill. They flew in disciplined formations, supported each other effectively, and refused to be drawn into turning fights where Japanese advantages were greatest. Some returning pilots mentioned incidents where they had achieved perfect firing positions only to have the American aircraft survive hits that should have been fatal, their armored cockpits and self-sealing tanks allowing pilots to escape situations that would have killed a Japanese aviator. These reports were largely dismissed by headquarters staff, who believed the veterans were making excuses for their own declining performance or exaggerating American improvements to justify increasing losses. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided the first test of whether American training innovations could work in large-scale combat. Navy pilots from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, many of them recent graduates with minimal combat experience, faced Japanese naval aviation in the first carrier battle, where the opposing ships never sighted each other. The green American pilots were terrified as they flew toward the Japanese fleet, knowing they faced the same veterans who had devastated Pearl Harbor just 5 months earlier. Yet when combat began, something unexpected happened. The Americans fought with a coordination and tactical discipline that surprised the Japanese pilots who had expected easy victories. Navy dive bomber pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal courage, scoring hits on the carrier Shoho and damaging the fleet carrier Shikaku despite heavy losses. Fighter pilots used the tactics they had learned in training, working in pairs and teams rather than as individuals, and they managed to hold their own against more experienced opponents. The battle was technically a draw, with both sides losing one carrier and suffering damage to others, but strategically it represented something momentous. For the first time, American naval aviators had met the Japanese on roughly equal terms, and the green pilots who were supposed to be hopelessly outmatched had proven they could fight effectively using their new training and tactics. The Japanese were shaken by the experience but attributed American success to luck rather than any fundamental change in capability. Surely, their commanders reasoned, this was an anomaly that would not repeat once the Americans faced truly elite Japanese units. That assumption would be tested just 1 month later at Midway, where the entire course of the Pacific War would pivot on the performance of American pilots who should have had no chance of victory. The dive bomber pilots who would win that battle averaged less than 1 year of flight experience, and some had never seen combat before that fateful morning in June. Fighter pilots protecting the fleet included recent flight school graduates who had been flying F-4F Wildcats for only a few weeks. According to every traditional measure of aviation capability, these men should have been massacred by the Japanese force approaching Midway. What actually happened would shock the world and prove that the American training revolution had created something genuinely new in military aviation. The Battle of Midway unfolded on June 4, 1942, with a series of American attacks that initially seemed to confirm Japanese expectations of easy victory. Torpedo bomber squadrons from 3 American carriers pressed home attacks with extraordinary courage, but were slaughtered almost to the last man, their slow, obsolete aircraft easy prey for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Japanese pilots shot down torpedo bombers with contemptuous ease, and observers on Japanese carriers watched the Americans die, while feeling a mixture of respect for their bravery and confirmation that American training produced inferior pilots. Then, in a span of 5 minutes, everything changed. American dive bomber squadrons arrived over the Japanese fleet at the exact moment when Japanese fighters were at low altitude after massacring the torpedo bombers, and Japanese carriers were in the vulnerable process of rearming aircraft. The dive bomber pilots, many of them recent graduates with minimal experience, executed their attacks with precision that should have required years of training. They had learned dive bombing through intensive, focused instruction that eliminated everything non-essential and drilled them endlessly on this one critical skill. They understood intellectually that a carrier was most vulnerable when caught with armed aircraft on deck, and they exploited this vulnerability with devastating effect. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's dive bombers against the carriers Kaga and Akagi, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown bombers struck Soryu. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks, their hangars full of armed and fueled aircraft that turned them into floating infernos. Japanese damage control parties, among the best in the world, found themselves overwhelmed by fires that grew too fast and too hot to contain. The 4th carrier, Huryu, launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown, but American dive bombers found Huryu later that afternoon and reduced her to a burning wreck as well. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or sunk, taking with them not just irreplaceable ships but hundreds of highly trained pilots and aircrew who represented years of investment in training programs that could not quickly replace such losses. The green American pilots had achieved what Japanese officers considered impossible, defeating veteran aviators through superior tactics, better coordination, and the systematic application of focused training in the specific skills that mattered most in carrier warfare. Japanese survivors returned to their bases in shock, unable to explain how they had lost so decisively to pilots who should have been easy victims. Midway marked a turning point not just in the Pacific War but in military aviation philosophy worldwide. The battle proved that intensive, focused training in combat-relevant skills could produce effective pilots far faster than traditional methods. American training programs doubled down on their innovations, incorporating lessons learned from Coral Sea and Midway to further refine their curriculum. The Navy established specialized schools teaching specific aspects of carrier warfare, allowing instructors to become experts in particular skills rather than generalists. Gunnery schools focused entirely on aerial combat, teaching students the physics of deflection shooting and drilling them, until firing at maneuvering targets became instinctive. Fighter tactics schools brought combat veterans back from the Pacific to share hard-won knowledge with new pilots preparing for deployment. The Army Air Corps created similar specialized schools, with experienced pilots teaching the specific tactics needed for different combat scenarios. Meanwhile, American industrial production began flooding the Pacific with new aircraft that incorporated lessons learned from early battles. The F-6F Hellcat fighter was designed specifically to fight the Zero, with engineers choosing to maximize diving speed, climb rate, and survivability rather than trying to match Japanese maneuverability. The F-4U Corsair offered even better performance, combining speed and firepower in a package that gave American pilots significant advantages. These aircraft worked synergistically with American training, allowing pilots to exploit tactics they had learned while negating Japanese advantages in turning combat. The combination of improved training, better tactics, and superior aircraft created a multiplying effect where each element enhanced the others. Japanese aviation, by contrast, began a slow decline from which it would never recover. The loss of 4 carriers at Midway was devastating, but the loss of experienced pilots and aircrew was catastrophic. Japanese training programs could not quickly replace these veterans because they still adhered to the lengthy, perfectionist approach that had served well in peacetime, but was completely unsuited to wartime attrition. As American pilots gained combat experience throughout late 1942, they went from being roughly equal to their opponents to being clearly superior in most engagements. The green pilots who had barely survived their first combats became veterans themselves, and they were better prepared than their Japanese opponents had ever been because American training had given them realistic expectations and proven tactics rather than relying on spirit and individual skill. The campaign for Guadalcanal became a 6-month test of whether American training innovations could sustain effectiveness through a long, grinding campaign of attrition. Marine and Navy pilots flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal faced daily attacks by Japanese bombers and fighters flying from bases in Rabaul. These were still largely the same veteran Japanese pilots who had dominated the early war, but now they faced Americans who had absorbed the lessons of earlier battles and refined their tactics through constant combat. The Cactus Air Force, as the Guadalcanal-based units were known, included a mixture of experienced pilots and fresh graduates, with the veterans teaching newcomers the realities of combat in a way no training program could duplicate. Young pilots arrived at Henderson Field with perhaps 200 hours of total flight time and were thrown immediately into combat, sometimes flying their first mission the day after arrival. Japanese officers expected these green pilots to be easy prey, but they discovered that American training had prepared them surprisingly well for combat realities. The new pilots knew the capabilities and limitations of their aircraft, understood the importance of maintaining formation discipline, and had been drilled endlessly in the specific tactics that worked against Japanese fighters. They still died in frightening numbers during their first few missions, but those who survived learned quickly and became effective combat pilots far faster than traditional training approaches would have predicted. The campaign saw the emergence of American aces who exemplified the new approach to pilot development. Men like Joe Foss and Marion Carl achieved high victory scores not through superior individual skill in the traditional sense, but through aggressive application of sound tactics and excellent gunnery. They attacked relentlessly, used their aircraft's strengths while avoiding situations that favored enemy capabilities, and worked with wingmen to create situations where numbers and coordination overwhelmed individual Japanese skill. Japanese pilots found themselves increasingly frustrated by opponents who refused to fight the way warriors were supposed to fight, who declined turning combat, and instead used diving attacks that exploited American aircraft advantages. The psychological impact on Japanese aviation was profound because their entire training philosophy and warrior culture emphasized individual combat prowess, and they found themselves defeated by men they considered inferiors using tactics they considered cowardly. By mid-1943, American pilot training had become an industrial process operating at a scale that staggered the imagination. The Army Air Corps was training more pilots per month than the entire Japanese Naval Air Service could graduate in a year. Navy training facilities processed thousands of students simultaneously through progressively more complex stages of instruction. The system worked like a factory assembly line, with students moving through stations where they acquired specific skills before advancing to the next stage. This industrial approach allowed continuous refinement of methods, with successful techniques quickly disseminated across all training bases, while ineffective approaches were ruthlessly eliminated. Training aircraft production kept pace with the expanding programs, with thousands of trainers rolling off assembly lines to replace aircraft destroyed in training accidents. The acceptance of high accident rates as a cost of rapid training was a conscious decision that saved the program from paralysis. Traditional safety-first approaches would have slowed training to unacceptable rates, but the cold calculus of wartime leadership recognized that some training deaths were preferable to the certain deaths that would result from insufficient pilot numbers. This decision haunted the officers who made it, but the results justified the cost. American pilot quality steadily improved as the training system incorporated feedback from combat operations. A typical fighter pilot graduating in mid-1943 had about half the total flight time of a Japanese pilot entering service in 1941, but the American pilot had spent far more time practicing combat-relevant skills like gunnery, formation flying, and specific tactical maneuvers. The American pilot understood his aircraft's capabilities and limitations through systematic instruction rather than through years of experimentation. He had practiced emergency procedures until they were automatic reflexes. He knew exactly what to do when bounced by enemy fighters because he had rehearsed those scenarios repeatedly in training. Japanese training still emphasized individual mastery and spiritual preparation, producing pilots with superior aircraft handling but less systematic knowledge of combat tactics. As the war progressed, this difference became more pronounced because American training could incorporate new lessons quickly, while Japanese training remained bound by tradition and increasingly limited by resource shortages. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the complete reversal of pilot quality that had occurred since the war's beginning. Japanese naval aviation launched a massive strike against American carriers, with pilots who averaged less flight time than their American opponents, because years of attrition had forced Japan to shorten its own training programs, without developing the systematic approaches that made American acceleration successful. These Japanese pilots flew obsolete aircraft against American pilots flying Hellcats and Corsairs, while guided by radar controllers who could vector them to intercept Japanese formations before they reached the fleet. The result was slaughter on a scale that shocked even the Americans who inflicted it. Navy pilots shot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day, with some pilots achieving multiple victories during a single mission. The combat was so one-sided that American pilots began calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, comparing it to shooting game birds rather than combat against skilled opponents. Japanese pilots attacked with courage that bordered on suicide, pressing home attacks despite devastating losses. But courage without skill or adequate equipment proved futile against the systematic efficiency of American fighter direction and pilot training. The green American pilots of 1942 had become hardened veterans by 1944, while Japanese veterans had been steadily killed off and replaced by increasingly poorly trained replacements. The pilots who had once mocked American training were mostly dead, shot down over jungles and oceans across the Pacific. Their replacements faced Americans who had benefited from continuous improvements in training, tactics, and equipment, while Japanese capabilities declined in every measurable category. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was devastating because they could see their own obsolescence. They were being defeated not by warriors who had trained longer or harder, but by a system that produced effective pilots more efficiently than their traditional methods could match. The spiritual superiority that Japanese culture had emphasized as the ultimate military advantage proved meaningless against opponents who combined adequate skill with superior numbers, better tactics, and overwhelming material advantages. By 1945, Japanese aviation had collapsed into desperation measures that reflected the complete failure of their training philosophy to adapt to modern warfare. The kamikaze attacks that characterized the war's final year were not expressions of warrior spirit, but admissions of defeat. Japan could no longer train pilots skilled enough to survive long enough to become effective, so they trained pilots just well enough to take off, navigate to a target, and crash into it. This required only minimal flight instruction, weeks rather than months, and eliminated all the traditional emphasis on individual mastery that had once defined Japanese aviation. American pilots encountering kamikaze attacks recognized them as symptoms of enemy desperation rather than displays of strength. The young men flying those suicide missions had less flight training than the greenest American pilots sent to combat, and they were equipped with obsolete aircraft that stood little chance of penetrating American defenses. Yet they still posed a threat because a pilot willing to die could sometimes succeed through sheer determination where skill might fail. American training had come full circle by the war's end. The rushed programs of 1942 had been refined into highly efficient systems that produced skilled pilots in reliable numbers. Training time had actually increased from the desperate early war minimums, as the Navy and Army Air Corps added back some elements that had been eliminated during the crisis period. The pilots graduating in 1945 were the beneficiaries of 3 years of continuous refinement in training methods, with curricula that incorporated lessons purchased with blood across the Pacific. These final-year graduates received better instruction in fewer hours than peacetime pilots had received in much longer programs, because every hour was optimized for maximum learning efficiency. The contrast between American and Japanese pilot quality by war's end was almost incomprehensible given the situation in early 1942. American pilots regularly achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1, meaning they shot down more than 10 Japanese aircraft for every American loss. Japanese pilots who had once dominated the Pacific skies were reduced to suicide attacks because they could no longer compete in conventional combat. The mockers had become the mocked, their proud traditions and lengthy training programs revealed as inefficient anachronisms in the face of systematic innovation. The story of how green American pilots defeated Japanese veterans contains lessons that extended far beyond World War II aviation. The fundamental insight was that task-specific training focused on measurable outcomes could produce competence far faster than traditional approaches emphasizing broad mastery and spiritual preparation. American training succeeded because it ruthlessly prioritized what actually mattered in combat, eliminating traditional components that contributed little to survival and victory. This required leaders willing to challenge established doctrine and accept approaches that seemed to violate everything previous experience taught. The Japanese failure was not a failure of courage or dedication, but a failure of adaptability. Their training system was optimized for peacetime development of highly skilled professionals, and when war demanded rapid mass production of adequate pilots, they could not abandon their traditional approaches quickly enough. Japanese culture's emphasis on perfection and mastery became a fatal liability when circumstances required accepting good enough and moving on. The warrior spirit that had seemed so powerful in early victories proved insufficient against opponents who combined adequate skill with superior numbers, better organization, and continuous innovation. American success demonstrated that systematic analysis of problems could overcome apparent disadvantages. The early American pilots were indeed inferior to their Japanese opponents in traditional measures of skill, but through careful study of combat conditions, Americans identified tactics that negated Japanese advantages while exploiting American strengths. The thatch weave, energy tactics, and emphasis on teamwork over individual prowess were all examples of using analysis to multiply effectiveness. This approach required cultural comfort with innovation and willingness to learn from mistakes, qualities that American culture possessed in abundance, but Japanese military culture actively suppressed in favor of obedience to tradition. The training revolution also highlighted the importance of feedback loops in any learning system. American training continuously incorporated lessons from combat, with veterans regularly rotated back to training commands to share knowledge and refine instruction. This created a system that improved itself automatically, becoming more efficient over time. Japanese training remained more static, with traditions and doctrine changing slowly despite evidence that methods were no longer working. This difference in organizational learning proved as important as any individual tactical innovation. The principles proven in World War II pilot training influenced military doctrine worldwide for generations. Modern military training across all services emphasizes task-specific skill development, realistic scenario training, and continuous incorporation of operational lessons. The idea that you could rapidly produce competent operators through focused instruction became foundational to how nations approach military readiness. Flight training specifically adopted the progressive, specialized approach pioneered during the war, with civilian flight schools and military programs worldwide using variations of the primary basic advanced progression developed to train tens of thousands of American pilots. The acceptance that high-intensity training would produce accidents, but that this cost was acceptable compared to inadequate preparation, became standard military thinking. Modern armed forces routinely conduct training exercises that carry real risks because preparing for actual combat requires experiencing realistic conditions. This approach traces directly back to the calculations made by American military leaders in 1942 when they accepted training casualties as the price of victory. Beyond military applications, The training revolution influenced education and professional development across society. The insight that carefully designed instruction focusing on essential skills could produce competence far faster than traditional broad-based education influenced everything from technical training to professional certification programs. The systematic analysis of what skills actually mattered for success in specific roles became standard practice in human resource development across industries. The World War II experience demonstrated that traditional assumptions about how long training must take were often wrong, and that focused, efficient instruction could compress timelines dramatically. The cultural lessons were equally profound. Japanese military culture's failure to adapt became a cautionary tale taught in military academies worldwide about the dangers of allowing tradition to override evidence. The importance of organizational learning, feedback mechanisms, and willingness to abandon failed approaches became central themes in military education. American success demonstrated that cultural comfort with innovation and pragmatic problem-solving could overcome apparent disadvantages in resources or preparation time. These lessons influenced Cold War military development and continue to shape how modern militaries approach training and doctrine development. Behind the statistics and strategic analysis were tens of thousands of individual stories of young men thrust into circumstances that tested them in ways they could never have imagined. The American pilots who graduated from rush training programs in 1942 knew they were inadequately prepared by traditional standards, but they flew anyway because their nation desperately needed them. Many died during their first missions, killed by veterans who had far more experience and better aircraft. Yet enough survived those initial encounters to learn, adapt, and eventually become the hunters rather than the hunted. These men carried psychological scars from experiences that would have broken earlier generations, but they also carried pride in having achieved what everyone said was impossible. The Japanese pilots who had mocked American training watched their certainties crumble as the war progressed. Veterans who had dominated early battles found themselves facing increasingly capable opponents while their own support deteriorated. They flew obsolete aircraft with dwindling fuel and ammunition against enemies who seemed to have unlimited resources. Many recognized that their training, for all its rigor and tradition, had not prepared them for the industrial-scale warfare that America brought to the Pacific. The spiritual preparation that was supposed to make them invincible proved worthless against opponents who combined adequate skill with overwhelming material superiority. Those who survived long enough saw their proud service reduced to training boys for suicide missions, the ultimate admission that the old ways had failed. The instructors who developed the revolutionary American training programs carried their own burdens. They made calculations about acceptable loss rates that meant sending young men to their deaths. They simplified and shortened training because time demanded it, knowing that some pilots would die because of skills they had not had time to learn. These instructors watched their students graduate and deploy, then waited for casualty reports that would tell them whether their innovations had worked or merely sent inadequately prepared boys to slaughter. The success of their programs validated the terrible choices they made, but validation did not erase the memory of students who died, because training could never eliminate all risks no matter how efficient it became. The success of American pilot training cannot be separated from parallel innovations in aircraft design, tactics development, and operational organization. Each element reinforced the others in a synergistic cycle that multiplied overall effectiveness. Aircraft like the Hellcat were designed specifically to work with the tactics that training emphasized, giving pilots platforms that rewarded the skills they had learned rather than requiring abilities they lacked time to develop. The Hellcat could not outturn a Zero, but it could outdive, outclimb, and outlast Japanese fighters while providing pilot protection that allowed Americans to survive mistakes that would kill Japanese pilots. This design philosophy meant that American pilots could be effective with less training, because their aircraft compensated for skill gaps that more experience would have filled. Radar and fighter direction systems multiplied pilot effectiveness by positioning them for advantageous attacks rather than requiring them to find enemies through visual search. Radio communications allowed coordination at scales impossible in earlier warfare, turning individual pilots into components of integrated air defense and strike systems. These technological advantages worked because training had prepared pilots to exploit them. American pilots understood how to work with fighter directors, how to maintain formation discipline during radar-directed intercepts, and how to coordinate attacks through radio communication. Japanese pilots flew as individuals or small groups with minimal coordination, their training having emphasized personal skill over systematic teamwork. The organizational innovation of rotating experienced pilots back to training commands created a knowledge feedback loop that continuously improved instruction. Combat veterans taught students the realities of aerial warfare in ways no peacetime instructor could match. They shared survival techniques learned through bitter experience, warned about common mistakes that killed new pilots, and reinforced the importance of tactics that training had emphasized. This connection between combat operations and training meant that American instruction stayed current with evolving conditions, while Japanese training remained bound by pre-war doctrine, even as that doctrine proved increasingly obsolete. The American training revolution succeeded, but at a cost that is often forgotten in celebrations of victory. Thousands of young men died in training accidents as the price of rapid, high-volume pilot production. Aircraft crashed during takeoffs and landings as students pushed themselves and their machines to limits. Mid-air collisions during formation training killed instructors and students alike. Some died because they were simply unsuited for flying, but were pushed through programs desperate for numbers. Others died because safety margins were deliberately reduced to accelerate training, a calculated trade-off that haunted those who made it. The families of men who died in training received little recognition because their losses occurred far from battle and contributed nothing to victory narratives that celebrated combat achievements. Yet these deaths were as much casualties of war as those killed over Pacific Islands, sacrifices necessary for the training revolution that ultimately won the air war. The psychological cost on surviving pilots was also significant, though less visible than physical casualties. Many men graduated from training programs knowing they were inadequately prepared by pre-war standards, carrying fear that their insufficient skills would get them killed. This fear was well-founded, as many died during their first missions against more experienced opponents. Those who survived often carried guilt about dead friends and questions about why they lived when others died. The intensity of combat flying produced psychological casualties that would today be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress, but were then dismissed as weakness or battle fatigue. Pilots who had flown too many missions became increasingly ineffective as stress degraded their performance, but military necessity often kept them flying until they died or broke completely. The Japanese paid an even higher price for their failure to adapt. Their lengthy training programs produced fewer pilots who then died at accelerating rates as American quality improved. By the war's end, Japanese aviation was sending boys with minimal training on suicide missions because conventional combat had become impossible. The cultural trauma of this defeat influenced Japanese society for generations. As a nation that had believed in the superiority of its warrior spirit confronted evidence that spirit without adequate resources and adaptable systems was insufficient for modern warfare. When historians analyze the Pacific Air War, the transformation of American pilot training stands as one of the most significant innovations of the conflict. It proved that traditional assumptions about training timelines were wrong, and that systematic analysis could produce methods far more efficient than those based on tradition and precedent. The mockery that Japanese officers initially directed at American training programs became evidence of their own failure to understand modern warfare's demands. They confused length of training with effectiveness, assuming that their lengthy programs naturally produced superior pilots without analyzing what components actually contributed to combat success. American success came from questioning every assumption, measuring actual results, and ruthlessly eliminating anything that did not contribute to combat effectiveness. This approach required cultural characteristics that American society possessed but Japanese military culture actively suppressed. The willingness to challenge authority, question tradition, and innovate based on evidence was deeply embedded in American culture, but contradicted Japanese values of obedience and respect for established ways. The battle between these approaches was as much a cultural conflict as a military one, and the outcome influenced post-war development in both nations. America's victory validated its pragmatic, innovation-focused culture and encouraged further development of systematic approaches to problems. Japan's defeat prompted painful cultural introspection and contributed to post-war adoption of more flexible, evidence-based approaches in many areas of society. The specific lesson about pilot training influenced military aviation worldwide, but the broader lesson about adaptability and systematic innovation influenced military thinking across all domains. Modern professional military forces worldwide emphasize the importance of organizational learning, feedback systems, and willingness to abandon failed approaches in favor of evidence-based innovation. These principles trace directly back to the hard lessons learned in the Pacific skies, where green American pilots fought Japanese veterans and proved that smart training could overcome traditional advantages in experience. The story of Japanese officers mocking American training until green pilots beat veterans is ultimately a story about the power of innovation to overcome apparent disadvantages. In early 1942, the situation seemed hopeless for American aviation. Japanese pilots had every advantage: more experience, better training, superior aircraft, and a warrior culture that emphasized combat above all else. American pilots were rushed through training programs that gave them a fraction of the preparation time their opponents enjoyed. By every traditional measure, the Americans should have been slaughtered. Yet through systematic analysis, ruthless prioritization, and continuous innovation, American training programs produced pilots who could first match and then exceed their opponents in combat effectiveness. The key insight was that not all training time was equally valuable, and that focused instruction on essential skills could produce combat capability far faster than traditional broad-based programs. This required leaders willing to challenge established doctrine and make difficult decisions about acceptable risk. It required a culture comfortable with innovation and pragmatic enough to adopt whatever worked regardless of how it conflicted with tradition. It required systematic incorporation of feedback from operations, creating a learning cycle that continuously improved the system. Most importantly, it required recognizing that the purpose of training was not to produce perfect pilots according to some traditional standard, but to produce pilots who could survive and win in actual combat conditions. American training succeeded because it focused relentlessly on that specific goal, while Japanese training remained oriented toward traditional ideals of mastery and perfection that, while admirable, were inefficient for wartime needs. The mockery that Japanese officers initially expressed toward American methods reflected their inability to distinguish between their goals and their methods, assuming that because their goals were worthy, their methods were necessarily optimal. This failure of analysis cost them the war and their lives.